Okay, good morning. And welcome to the Labour panel, the panel on Labour. We have three speakers. My name is Phumla Gola, and I will introduce them in the way that they appear. Our first speaker is Jamela Hoveni, and she will be speaking. Her paper is an intersectional analysis of workplace discrimination in South African labour markets. So she will speak, and then the next, and then we'll have a joint question and answer session at the end.
Thanks, Phumla. Thanks, everyone, for your presence. And I suppose I'll just get straight into the presentation. As Phumla has already explained or introduced my topic, it's around intersectionality in labor markets, looking at issues of discrimination. And on my slides, I highlighted workplace experiences, also empowerment issues, and issues of inclusiveness. And I think this whole debate around inclusivity in South Africa, in the economy, is quite relevant at the moment. I mean, the Minister of Finance a few weeks back was talking about inclusive growth in the context of radical economic transformation. So these are all very relevant issues at the moment. So in sort of framing the discussion, and I hope my presentation is visible. It doesn't seem to be very visible, and if it's not, I apologize. I posed a few questions. Is it readable? Should we maybe switch off the lights? And you know, I use this background because is it better? Yeah. Thank you. I was going to be so discouraged because I chose this background intentionally. This is actually a place in Limpopo where I come from, a village in Limpopo. This is you know, I don't even know the English word, but is it a cow crawl? It's like a cow crawl where people keep cows. And you know, the village where I come from, the soil is red. You can see the background is red because the soil is red. I picked this picture as a background for my presentation because issues around workplace experience of Black women are very personal issues for me, as I will explain later and relate some stories. So for me, it's very important to have this background, which is a very personal background. So hence the background. So I'm posing a few questions here. The first question, which is very much an intersectional question, is around the relationship between gender inequality and other complex inequalities in the economy. So gender inequalities, race inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, as you can imagine them variously. And another question was, what role does the private sector, or what role do private institutions, state institutions, play in reproducing these inequalities? And, you know, coming back to economics and the issue of justice, I think is also, again, very relevant in the context of radical economic transformation. Is, can economic institutions deliver on justice? And, you know, if you talk about justice, then again, you have to ask the question of what is justice and what is just. Another question is, what is the role of public policy in institutional design? And I think from an economic point of view, or an institutional economic point of view, these issues are institutional issues. So I think in terms of a discussion on how interventions can be potentially framed, we have to look at institutions and the design of institutions. Finally, the tricky place, I suppose, is around issues of methodology. If we're going to incorporate the sort of intersectionality into economics, and because as we were chatting this morning with Jan and my fellow presenter here, you know, as economists, we have we come from a specific standpoint in terms of analysis and methodology, but again, because these methodology and these analysis, they speak to real issues of black women, issues that are complex in the intersectional thinking. The issues that we need to grapple with. But then again, how methodologies which are primarily positivist speak to issues of real life experience is, I think, the thing that is relevant here. So, I mean, I've already mentioned the sort of the intersectional issues and intersectionality. Yesterday there was a debate about whether black women or black feminists are the ones who came up with this idea of intersectionality, you know, and it was quite a lovely debate. But I suppose the idea is that the black critical race academic Kimberly Crenshaw is the one who actually related intersecting identities to the issue of black women. Around the issues of their work experiences and issues of their lived experiences generally in life. So to that extent, for me, it was important to have that. It's a prominent feature of what the black feminists have to say about intersectional issues. So how do they understand intersectionality? Well, intersectionality speaks to the intersection of identities, social identities like race and gender, and how those intersecting, the way they are framed, speaks to how people experience inequalities in life. So race inequalities or gender inequalities. And they argue that these inequalities are not independent, all right? They are intersecting, interlocking categories of inequalities, and specifically for black women, they act to exclude or erase their experiences. They erase their experiences and effectively exclude them from the economy. So Kimberly Crenshaw distinguishes between two forms of intersectionality. She speaks of structural intersectionality and political intersectionality. Structural intersectionality is actually at the level of these identities, how they are framed and how that actually speaks to the inequalities that people experience. The political intersectionality is around issues of, so it's at the level of political agendas, priorities, and policies, how intersecting agendas that are in principle framed around inequalities actually intersect. So I think we can think of the agenda of black people generally, the anti-racist struggle versus the agenda of black women. And the argument is that at the level of policy, there is political intersectionality in the sense that the way that policies are framed to speak to these inequalities, there is a kind of conflict between these two identities of black men and black women. So that's political intersectionality. And then I'll just come to my case studies, the choice of my case studies. There are two case studies, and it's that I at least consider in this whole debate. But for the paper that informed the bulk of this presentation, I'll focus on the one case study. The first case study is a personal case study. I worked in corporate investment banking for 6 years, and my work experience as a black woman in investment banking is something that I'm trying to make sense of in the intersectional, sort of intersectional way of thinking. So that's the first case study that I'm considering. That is a bigger study that I think will inform my PhD, because I think lived experiences, as the feminists, as Pumla and the others argued yesterday, are so important. They're actually the site of creative theorizing. So for me, it's so important that my PhD speaks to my lived experience, because I think that's the place where I can be creative and engage in meaningful theorizing and meaningful discourse. So that's the one case study. The second case study, which is the bulk of this presentation, is just thinking about the socioeconomic position of black women in South Africa generally in the economy. And I think this case study of black women in South Africa just highlights so clearly these intersectional issues. So as far as black women are concerned in South Africa, and locating inequalities, again, these are the issues. If we try and locate inequalities in South Africa, in poverty, in income, however you imagine them, I think black women are central to this location of inequalities in South Africa. And these are inequalities in access to opportunities, to income, and those sort of issues. But I think the issue here, and coming back to intersectionality, is the fact that these inequalities are systematic, isn't it? They're systematic and they're persistent in as far as they relate to black women. Okay, so in understanding and making sense of intersectional issues, I think we really need to put the labor market at the center of this debate, because the labor market, as most economists will actually agree, is actually central to understanding socioeconomic inequalities, because it's a place where people work, where they can earn a living, and so on. Okay, but I think labor markets are often viewed as being outside of issues of justice. If we have to talk about justice, what is just? Labor markets, because they are markets, and markets are often viewed as outside of the debate on justice. They're viewed as beyond, issues of justice, which is not a very realistic kind of conception of markets as institutions, because the exercise of power within institutions and markets form part of institutions, actually very important in determining outcomes. So the exercise of power and where power is exercised is where we actually get these inequalities. So we can't get away from issues of justice, issues of power. And then just a comment there, just to say, but if we have to talk about justice in labor markets in the economy, what is the character of just outcomes or just policies? So I mean, a lot of, I'm just going to bring out everything on the slides just to make it easy and quick. A lot of the stuff that I'm presenting today are thoughts that I'm considering as I'm writing this paper, as I'm making sense of this research. As I said, a lot of it is part of my PhD research, which is still at a very early stage. So I won't present a lot of solutions. I'll present a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts, a lot of theoretical ideas that I think people need to engage with in this context. So what are some of the challenges for us as economists trying to make sense of these intersectional issues? I posed a question at the beginning about issues around methodology, and I think these methodological challenges are some of the challenges that I identify. So specifically, if in terms of intersectionality, the way that it's framed by intersectional thinkers, it's this idea that these categories, that social categories that describe people, they are fluid categories, they're not fixed. Okay, and also this idea that they are mutually constituted, they constitute each other as they interact, such that at the point of intersection they argue. For black women, if you can imagine the black woman at the point of intersection of race and gender, the outcome is a changed kind of, I won't say the black woman is changed, because that sounds kind of difficult to imagine. So it's not that the person is changed, but her experience is changed by the intersection of these categories. So these ideas are so difficult to imagine at the level of analysis. How do you analyze things that are fluid, they're changing, they're mutually constituting each other? Okay, so and some of the debates here by feminist economists clearly are around the nature of this reality that we're trying to analyze. So the ontology. So what is the nature of this reality? So I suppose a more to begin to make sense of how to even analyze these case studies is to grapple with the ontology. What is the precise ontology? And I think that will naturally guide how analysis will proceed. I saw some feminist economists are talking about a critical realist approach to this sort of analysis. And critical realism is really around a very rich, complex ontology of social systems. And they argue that, a complex ontology of society actually speaks to the complexity of intersectional issues. So just some of the challenges that I highlighted for us as economists and trying to grapple with these issues. This is more, again, an elaboration of stuff that I've already spoken about, so I won't discuss that slide, but I wanted to focus on political intersectionality as it relates to this case study of mine of Black women. And in the abstract, I spoke about BEE and affirmative action, because these are institutions and strategies, political strategies that are meant to address this problem of Black women. And I suppose the criticism is that they failed to integrate Black women into the economy meaningfully. And what do we mean by meaningful integration? So a meaningful integration of Black women into the economy would be an integration that reduces the unemployment, which seems to affect them mostly. It reduces the unemployment. It provides decent work, secure jobs, such things. And this discussion of institutions and policies, it brings me back again to this debate around inclusiveness, which is central to the idea of institutions, as I will explain in a minute. That making sense of intersectionality in the economy from an economics point of view demands making sense of the role of institutions in societies. So what are the institutions in societies? What are their role? What do they look like? And once we make sense of the role of institutions, then we can move to the next level of what do these institutions need to look like. So I used a very institutional economics. I'll just pause on this slide for a bit. I think it's important. Where I was asking the question, but how does mainstream economics make sense of these issues? Not very well, because in mainstream economics, there's this idea that discrimination cannot exist because competition is supposed to eliminate discrimination. But then within economics, there is institutional economics, and I felt like, within institutional economics is at least a place where you can begin to make sense of these things. So I focus on institutions for the rest of the presentation. And again, the question is around what sort of institutions do we need to promote in society? What does this institutional design need to look like to promote justice, and to create a more inclusive economy? So I used a very simple matrix of that is often used in institutional economics, which compares political and economic institutions, and it tries to locate countries within this matrix of an inclusive political institutions versus exclusive political institutions, inclusive economic institutions versus exclusive economic institution, and the idea is that nations, they map somewhere on this matrix, and where they map and where they sit determines the outcome. So just as a way of engaging you guys, I was just wondering if you can guess where South Africa would map on this sort of matrix. And I think I have actually put it earlier in my slides where I think South Africa fits, but over here, we have so-called successful nations, and apparently successful nations are those that map between inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions. Unsuccessful nations are somewhere down there, and they combine an exclusive economy with an exclusive politics. So where do you imagine South Africa would map on this? There's no right or wrong answer. Is it down there or up there or somewhere in between?
Down there, yes.
So somewhere here, but closer to the middle, because South Africa's politics are quite fairly inclusive, isn't it? But it's argued that the economy is quite exclusive. So I I think, trying to grapple with these issues, which are institutional issues, is important for us as economists, feminist economists, or feminist black feminists who are just interested in justice. So, my last slide really is just a summary of thoughts again, and I mean these are all, they were all thoughts and ideas that I engaged with when I thought of this presentation and coming to speak here, and it's coming back to justice as far as it relates to black women, to marginalized identities in the economy. And I'll use the word marginalized to capture the idea that it's not just black women who are marginalized. A lot of people are marginalized in society. But specifically relating to my case is to integrate black women into the economy, meaningfully reduce their unemployment, reduce income and wealth inequality, produce sustainable and meaningful jobs. And I think policy interventions and political strategies should be framed around the role of institutions, how institutions can be designed. And then coming back to the theme of this conference, which is around African feminism, intersectional issues, I think an intersectional approach to inequalities, which are very complex, is very helpful because it gives a very holistic view of what actually the lived experience and the lived reality of inequalities for many people is, and I think that's quite helpful. And as I mentioned earlier, this sort of analysis is not uncomplicated. It seems to be very complicated, but the complexity is important, but also an analysis that lends itself to analysis is also important in terms of framing policy and interventions. So, and yeah, that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamela, for several things, but thanks for a very kind of thought-provoking presentation that I think is a fantastic note on which to start. As we were walking here, Yvette was saying to me, "Oh, I'm so excited that African feminists are doing this economics work." So I think I share that. I think that we certainly need, I think, more of that. And I think also it's wonderful. Because one of the kind of most exciting things about forums such as these, where we because sometimes I think so much academic work happens in disciplines, right, and in kind of allied disciplines, or kind of thematically kind of allied rather than kind of So thank you very much for that. But also, I'm incredibly efficient use of time. You use less than I was like, oh, I'm going to give her warning soon. That's just 5 minutes, but I didn't need to. So thank you very much. I look forward to a discussion of your paper afterwards. Our second speaker is Thembinkosi Twalo from the HSRC, who will be speaking to us on perpetuation of female dependency syndrome in South Africa. Mirrors religious narratives, the case of Ruth. Over to you, 10 minutes.
Morning, colleagues. How are you, colleagues? Very well, thank you. Right. Just to give, I'll be talking about the issue of the perpetuation of the dependency syndrome among South African females, and I'm using a historical text, biblical text, to investigate this. And I would like you to help me conceptualize I'll be talking about several. We are a country that has so many challenges, and my aim is not just to end up identifying the challenges and it ends there. Of all the challenges I would be unpacking, I wish I could come up, or we could come up with a form of a solution towards that. So as I would be talking, I would appreciate if you can just apply your minds on something that would be doable in terms of trying to address the challenges our country is facing. Just in brief, the story of Ruth, for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with it. It is recorded that about 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, in Bethlehem, there was a family led by a husband. Elimelech was the husband, and they migrated to a country called Moab because of drought in Bethlehem. And they spent about 10 years in Moab, and the family, that is Elimelech and the two sons, passed away while they were in this country of Moab. And Ruth, Naomi, the wife to this guy, came back to Bethlehem when things were okay. She came back with a daughter-in-law by the name of Ruth, and they owned a property which they inherited from their husband. So they were this family that had this resource. So I would say that they were resource rich but cash poor. Okay, I've mentioned that I'm using this biblical narrative for several reasons. One of them being that this is a historical narrative depicting something that would be similar to the situation that we find in South Africa. And I'm using this to draw parallels between our contemporary society and the then society, plus minus 1,000 years BC. Just to draw parallels to see how women have been locked in situations that would enable the perpetuation of their domination, exploitation through culture, through systems, through ideology, and other forms of oppression. And I also have some few examples of that I will refer to, of women who find themselves locked in these circumstances. One of the significant things about drawing these parallels is the issue of decision making. It's a key thing for me because the quality of decisions we make is influenced by a number of things, including the circumstances we find ourselves in. The quality of decisions we make in compromised situations is reflected in the quality of the decisions we make. The circumstances influence how we make those decisions. And when people are locked in situations, they then make decisions that would perpetuate their domination by men. In this story, one of, like I mentioned, this family owned property. And one of the things before I get there, you may recall not so long ago in South Africa, there was the Bantustan system. And it was a situation whereby people were put into specific areas in line with their ethnicity, and would be confined in those areas. I come from Queenstown, and 45 kilometers, okay, I don't come from Queenstown. I come from around Queenstown. We were in Ciskei, which is 45 kilometers from Queenstown. And at home we had a shop. So for the shop was, for doing the stocking, we had to go to Queenstown. And my father had to get permission to buy stuff in the Republic, which is Queenstown. And roughly 20 kilometers from Queenstown towards the Transkei side, you needed passport to get there. So that's the kind of situation we were locked in. Our movement, our mobility was so restricted. There were, of course, a number of these things. And this, for me, showed the circumstances that many women find themselves in, how they found themselves being locked in situations in which they cannot make quality decisions, in which they cannot fend for themselves, in which they cannot be economically active. One of the key themes in the book of Ruth is the issue of kindness. Boaz, the new husband to Ruth, Ruth later got remarried to a guy called Boaz. He was very kind to this family. He allowed them to glean. Then, when people were harvesting, they were not allowed to harvest everything. They had to leave the corners of the field so that the poor can come and harvest for themselves. So Boaz allowed this family to come and pick for themselves at the corners of his fields. And this kindness worked in his favor. There's actually some argument around the book of Ruth, because there's excitement on the one side that here's one book in the Bible which is male dominated that raises women's issues. But on the other side, people are taking a closer look at this, saying that as much as this is foregrounding women's issues, but whose interests are being served in the whole story. So if you look at it properly, you would see that even the kindness of Ruth actually was for his benefit. He may have meant it well, but in the long run, he is actually the one who benefited from this structure and system. And his kindness translated to the diminishing of self-reliance of these women, because they gave away their property to him, sold it to him. In fact, that it was a package, that the marriage deal was a package, that whoever buys the property must marry Ruth. And the purpose for marrying Ruth was so that she can be taken care of. And I found that to be so disempowering, because if you give away your property so that you can be taken care of, it means whoever is buying your property will have a final say in your life, will control your life, will be able to do anything in his favor. One of the things done by the lady Ruth was to approach this guy. The culture then was that the close relative should marry the widow. So he was one of the they were called kinsmen redeemers. He was one of the kinsmen redeemers, the close relatives who were obligated to marry the widow so that they can continue the lineage of the deceased husband. One of the things she does in approaching this guy was to put on some very beautiful attire to present herself to this guy. And there was seduction as well, because she went to him in the evening and light in below his feet, and requested him to cover her with his sort of blanket that he was using. And he did this, she did this after the guy had taken some few glasses of wine. So that was actually the strategy, that you must be looking good, but you must also approach him in his bed after he's taken some few drinks. And the issue of alcohol and sex is something that is used several times in the Bible, the combination of these two. And this is something that is often used when there are practices that are antisocial, so to say, because even in the case of Lot, the daughters got him drunk so that he could impregnate them. In the case of Ruth and Boaz, there was a very big age gap, because at the beginning Boaz was referring to her as his daughter, and the same daughter got married to him. So these issues get the issue of alcohol in the text then covers up a number of these things, and also the question of decision making, that it compromises the quality of decisions that get taken. Newman looks at the issue of behavior by people who are compromised due to alcohol. I would like to read this one, saying that physiologically, alcohol use loosens inhibitions and impairs cognitive functions, which may lead to unsafe sexual behavior, essentially unprotected sex. And this is something we find very common in a number of situations in South Africa, due to several reasons. Of course, we may get to those in a while. And Schupa and colleagues, they observe that alcohol alters the brain's whatever acid receptors, and changes the body's serotonin levels, which translates to disinhibition again. So the argument by these scholars is that the quality of thinking and decisions that are taken in such a context gets to be compromised. The next slide is about reports of people who found themselves in this situation, and it shows how trapped they are because of the combination of the two, and also because of their economic circumstances that they found themselves in. I'll give you a minute to read for yourselves just these reports from these people who found themselves in these situations. And this is Stokvel Sex, which is also called Mavuso. From this, we can see the desperation, the levels of desperation, the levels of hopelessness, the levels of being locked in these circumstances. And the key thing here is economics. Because of being disempowered and not having sources of income, the alternatives is engaging in these situations. And one of the things, like I mentioned, for instance, the question of age between Boaz and Ruth, is there are several studies done that reflect the issue of power dynamics in intergenerational relationships, that when people are in these forms of relationships, the quality of decisions that get taken actually tend to favor the dominant partner in this situation, because it's usually because of affordability, because usually males would be the ones who would be able to afford whatever the ladies would be needing. So the study done by the Human Sciences Research Council, led by Professor Shisana, they uncovered the prevalence of mothers encouraging their daughters to engage in a practice called ukupanda, meaning having a blesser for yourself, or a sugar daddy, or someone older than yourself who would be able to take care of your needs. And these are rather risky relationships because of the power dynamics that I've mentioned, and issues of HIV/AIDS, the spread of it get easy because, for instance, the issue of the use of condoms, for instance, because of the power dynamics in such a relationship, the women then get to be compromised and not be able to stand their ground. So, like I indicated at the beginning, this wanted to do it so that I can come up with some ideas around practical solutions to the identified situations that disempower women. There are several challenges that women are facing. And for me, it's not just about identification of those challenges, but coming up with practical solutions to address them and to ensure their self-reliance. The problem is complex, and a multi-pronged approach would be ideal, I think, because I'm thinking, for instance, at an institutional level, we could talk about doing some collaborations around these issues and engaging in some research around these issues. But at a personal level as well, I think we also need to make some effort, because it's so easy to criticize the government about what's not done or what's done wrongly and so on. But a statement attributed to Mother Teresa is that she says, we can clean the whole world if we all clean our front yards. So I think if at an individual level we can do something, then we could be able to address the challenges underlined in this. I thank you.
Also very good adherence to time, and I think also a presentation that brings together things that we don't spend much time thinking about. So I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Our third speaker is Nimi Hoffmann, who will be speaking about the unfolding of African feminism in CODESRIA.
So I'm at ISA at this university. For some reason my affiliation was given as CODESRIA as well, which is not true. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about CODESRIA, who they are. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about one part of the story as to how African feminism, one kind of African feminism, emerged within CODESRIA, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications, the intellectual and organizational implications of this for CODESRIA. Okay, so who is CODESRIA? It's the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and it's a pan-African community of scholars. And it was conceptualized in 1964 and formalized in 1973 with the aim of fostering greater collaboration between African scholars in order to challenge the marginalization. So it's actually the oldest pan-African intellectual community on the continent. And it kind of outlasted the OAU and therefore is older than the AU. I think that's kind of interesting. And it's the first major Pan-African organization to be established and to operate on a purely voluntary basis outside the intergovernmental and international systems. It was, and I think still is, a pioneering organization in an untried territory. So they have diplomatic standing, actually, and they have observer status at the AU, but instead of their constituent members being member states, their constituent members are individual African intellectuals and representatives of African institutions, intellectual institutions like universities. Okay, so what does CODESRIA do? They're a community who create, manage, and distribute their own intellectual goods outside of the structures of the state and the market. They act as a Pan-African forum for critiquing and generating intellectual work, and they provide training and support to scholars across the continent. All their intellectual work is freely available and can get accessed in Arabic, French, English, and Portuguese, the main academic languages of the continent, but not in other African languages, aside from Arabic, which... yeah. Okay, so because they're a community who are self-organized and self-governing, we can think of them as a commons. A knowledge commons is a system in which intellectual goods are managed and produced by a community through a process of collective action and self-governance. So if you look at the table below, right, one of the ways of thinking about goods is in terms of how, one of the ways of thinking of epistemic goods is in terms of how they are managed, right? So if they're not managed by a community and they're privately owned, then they're a private good, like Thomson Reuters. Public goods are ones managed by a state and also not privately owned. Club goods are managed by a community, but they're privately owned. And common goods are ones which are managed by a community and not privately owned. So recent examples of this are Wikipedia and the Human Genome Project. And what's interesting about this is that CODESRIA predates this by 40 years. I think that's really, really exciting and interesting. And the knowledge commons perspective is a really kind of, it's been developed in the last 10 years or so, and it comes out of an older tradition looking at natural resource commons, which was developed by Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues, the first and only female economist to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And they looked at natural resource commons, so like, for example, commons where people share pasture, it doesn't belong to anyone and everybody collectively manages it. And then about 10 years ago, Ostrom, just before she died, started to think about knowledge of the commons. And so she'd spent, her entire life thinking about natural resource systems and about how people outside of the state and outside of the market can sustainably manage natural resources, particularly in the context of climate change. And she then began to think about knowledge. And it's an interesting theoretical perspective insofar as it seeks to understand how systems become path-dependent and how a community can act collectively to change this path dependency. So in the context of African scholarship, the path dependency is clear, right? We marginalize ourselves within the academy, and African scholarship is then marginalized between the North and the South as well. Okay, so at this point I should just say, when I started this study of CODESRIA, I didn't think about feminism at all. And I thought about it as a story of male scholars, African male scholars. And in 2015, a really beautiful thing happened. A kind of a really unapologetic young black feminism emerged in this country. And that kind of forced me to kind of go back to the archive and start rethinking CODESRIA and to start looking more carefully at what kind of feminist work might be there. Because I'd seen like references to gender, in some of their publications, but I kind of thought it was like a kind of a woman in development gender, right? So it's like co-opting the use of the term gender in order to satisfy donor requirements. I didn't think it was a feminist kind of thing. I was really wrong. Okay. So, so this African Knowledge Commons emerged in response to inequality, but it also has inequality within the commons, right? If you look at this kind of the analysis of their financial support for graduate students between 1987 and 2010, I'm sorry, the color you can't see very well, but this bottom line here is female students, and this top line here is male students. Okay, and if I go over here, this is book publications. The bottom line over there is books that include one female author, and at least one female author. And the top line are books that include no female authors. Okay. And so between 1979 and 1991, only 10% of students who received financial support were female. And in that period, only 5% of all books published included at least one female author. Okay, so this tells you that there are specific rules around membership in the organization. Not only membership today, but membership for the future as well. Okay, and it's for this reason that CODESRIA has often been described as a boys' club. Like literally a boys' club. And in that period, not a single book published by CODESRIA explicitly examines gender relations. Okay, so there's also a rule, not only around membership, but there's also a rule around what kind of intellectual work can be produced within the organization. It's a tacit rule, it's not spoken, but it's there. Okay. Oh wait, let me just go back. But you can see that things start to change around about this time, right? 1991. Okay. First, you start to see a spike in the number of female students who are being supported. And a couple of years later, you can start to see a spike in the number of books published by women. Okay. And this actually has to do with an event that occurred within CODESRIA. It was in 1991, and I'm going to look at that event. Okay. It was a gender workshop. It was the first time ever that they had a conference looking at gender. The first time in suppose 20 years. Okay. So the emergence of this gender workshop is a really complicated story, and there are many different strands. Okay, and I'm just going to look at one strand because I think it's a really interesting strand. And this is a Pan-African organization for female scholars, AWARD, which was founded in 1977, so just 4 years after CODESRIA was formalized as a Pan-African organization essentially for men. A Pan-African organization for female scholars was founded. Okay, and it was founded during the UN Decade for Women when Northern feminist scholarship converged with developmental agencies to usher in a new period of scrutiny into the lives of women in former colonies, which initially coalesced around discourses of women in development. And it kind of, it catalyzed intense contestations. This is when you start to see women in the global south saying, no, Northern feminism is a kind of imperialism. And so this is kind of one of the catalysts for the establishment of AWARD, and they get established in Dakar, in the same place that CODESRIA has its offices. Okay. And in the beginning, they have a kind of a very explicitly anti-feminist ethos, in the sense of anti-Northern feminism, but it becomes a kind of a general anti-feminist ethos. So, for example, Aminata Jao, who sadly passed away late last year, who was a feminist, superb feminist philosopher from Senegal, said to be a feminist was not what we did at AWARD. In fact, it was a leftist anti-colonial approach. We were not even anti-patriarchy. So for instance, with female genital mutilation, we discussed this in AWARD at the very beginning in the 1980s, and they said, no, that is a cultural practice. It took us about a decade to decide, well, it's not in fact, it's a mutilation. Okay, and the dynamics around that are really complex, and I don't have time to get into it. It's like they're actually very considered opinions, and there are very good reasons for why they took that particular position. But I just want to point that out. Okay. However, even though in the beginning they have this kind of anti-feminist ethos, they're pan-African, and they're connected to women's organizations on the ground in different countries across the continent. And so what this does is it creates space for the emergence of a kind of a Pan-African feminism. So Fatou Sarr, also a Senegalese thinker, really wonderful, she says, reflecting on this, because if you read A-Ward papers, you don't find very often feminism except to condemn it. But you know, the first time I went to A-Ward, hosted by CODESRIA, it was the first time I was sitting with actual women and discussing. It was the first time I sat with Moroccan women from Sierra Leone, from Nigeria, and that achievement was something that made all Africans interested. And so, you know, towards the middle of the 1980s, A-Ward catalyzes the establishment of Dawn, which is a Global South feminist network. And they begin to take a kind of a sort of a less apologetic feminist stance. And they begin to be a little bit more strident. And what I should also just maybe say it here. So A-Ward gets founded in Dakar, and CODESRIA is in Dakar, right? But because it's female scholars, they have very little resources for all sorts of reasons that I think we're all aware of, right? So these female scholars then go to CODESRIA, to the male scholars in CODESRIA, and they say, can we have some support? And in part because they have this kind of anti-feminist ethos, the male scholars are like, okay, yeah, you can have some space in our offices. Okay, so this is the beginning of the relationship between A-Ward and CODESRIA. Okay. However, the 80s is also the period of structural adjustment on the continent, right, which is a kind of a complete assault on the political, economic, and intellectual underpinnings of African societies. Okay, and women's autonomous organizing becomes the key battleground on which structural adjustment is waged. And its gendered impacts contribute to the decline of women's organizations such as A-Ward, for all sorts of reasons. So, for example, the attempt to sort of privatize public universities hits females the hardest. Female students get hit the hardest, which means that there are even less female academics, and they're all scrambling for resources, and in this kind of intense contestation over resources, women end up like often losing out, and they then also have extra work to do, and everything kind of just coalesces during this incredible, difficult time, and you start to see female scholars dropping out of the academy. Okay, a lot of female scholars dropping out of the academy, and it becomes really difficult to sustain an organization like A-Ward. There are other reasons as well for A-Ward's decline, but this is one of them. Okay, and at the same time, while A-Ward was initially hostile to the idea of feminism, right, like I said earlier, its Pan-African structure enabled a pan-continental feminist intellectual community to develop. And it attempted to appropriate and subvert the assault of structural adjustment so that it created space for new forms of thinking. And I think one of the kind of the key areas that it did this was by producing like some really important empirical studies on the gendered dimensions of structural adjustment and critiques of alternatives to structural adjustment such as the Lagos Plan of Action. Okay, and the third aspect of structural adjustment is that there's a discursive aspect, right? So structural adjustment kind of coincides with the UN Decade for Women, which starts in 1985. And Isabel Casemiro, who's written quite extensively on this, she's a Mozambican scholar, she says, we had 10 years of women's discourses around the world. Even African governments actually realized that women were sitting there and had their own agenda. Even if they misapplied the agenda, they took the wording, but they didn't do the politics. Okay? So the time was appropriate. It was the time, it was in the air for thinking about gender. And so structural adjustment would then, you know, it forced governments to become a lot more donor dependent, and then donors would then kind of impose a kind of a women in development approach on governments. And so you start to see this kind of lip service attention paid to gender. And again, really complex dynamics that I don't have time to get into, but you can see there are these three different elements. Okay. So A-Ward declines, and you've got all of these female scholars who are located physically in the same space as CODESRIA. And it's natural for them to start moving towards CODESRIA, because during this time, CODESRIA does not decline. Oh no, the CODESRIA expands incredibly. And so, structural adjustment becomes a kind of a And again, part of the reason for this is actually the gender dimensions of structural adjustment. And so they start seeking a home. And so they move into CODESRIA, right? But they face incredible resistance to talking about gender. Incredible resistance. And when they're able to host their first gender workshop, they invite men and women to the gender workshop. And Thembinkosi, who is a Malawian economist, who was at that time the executive secretary of CODESRIA, didn't want to host it, right? He really didn't want to host it, he didn't want to be there. But here's something really interesting that happens, right? And this is what he says. He says, when I opened this conference a few days ago, I confidently, or rather foolhardily, stated, I am not convinced there is a corpus of methodologies, approaches, or empirical studies based on gender analysis awaiting to be appropriated by a newly converted social science community. Much work needs to be done. After listening to the discussions and after reading some of the papers, I'm convinced that my remarks were as good a case of the total triumph of ignorance over intellectual humility and open-mindedness as ever there was. I would therefore like to rephrase my remark as follows. I am now convinced there is a corpus of methodologies, approaches, or empirical studies based on gender analysis awaiting to be appropriated by newly converted social science community. I do, however, maintain much work needs to be done. And so we can see that there is a struggle over reason. There is a struggle, women and feminists in general are struggling to be seen as reason-bearing, okay? And this poses then the question, how do dissident thinkers on the margins of a group's consensus make their thought reasonable to the consensus, worth considering, worth engaging with? This is just about hostility toward African feminism. I'm going to skip this one, I think, and this as well. Okay, so I think the key way in which they do this is through collective action. Okay, if you want to, you have to force people to recognize your reason, and the only way you can do that, especially if you're a marginalized group, especially if you're a minoritized group, is through collective action. Okay, so what happens? First, it's a process to get there. They first begin making interventions in conferences, and these interventions are completely elided. They're not recorded, and they're literally disappeared from the institutional memory of CODESRIA. There's no record of them. Okay, and it's a form of censorship as well, right? It's as though they never existed. It's as though these debates were never raised. Okay. But then what they do is, as a group, they go and they pressurize CODESRIA for a gender workshop, which includes both female and male scholars, and they then make a kind of an inroad into the scientific committee of CODESRIA, right? So CODESRIA has a scientific committee which governs its intellectual agenda, and then it has an executive committee which kind of governs politically the organization. It's impossible for them to get into the political leadership of the organization. They don't have the numbers because they have to get voted in, right? But it is possible for them to get into the scientific leadership of the organization because it's seen as less important. So they make these kind of quiet encroachments, right, into the scientific committee as a group, and they then begin to push their agenda. Okay, and this results in the first journal publications on gender in CODESRIA, and they also managed to succeed in changing the archive. So after this, the archive then goes back to those earlier debates in the 80s and says, actually, there were these debates, and this is what people were saying about that. And so you see a change in the institutional memory of the organization. Okay, and through the scientific committee, they compel CODESRIA to commit to an annual gender institute for training on gender, a gender book series, and the development of annotated bibliographies on African feminist scholarship. So critical. They also see a change in the politics of representation, and by 2003, CODESRIA elects its first female president. But their minoritization in CODESRIA means that they are unable to institutionalize monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, so that concrete steps are taken to sustain and expand the role of female scholars and feminist scholarship in the organization. So if you remember those two graphs that I showed a little bit earlier on, do you remember that the number of women participating in CODESRIA in terms of book publications and being sponsored remained consistently low? I mean, it went up from like almost nothing to like 20%, but then it kind of hovers then, it never changes, right? And this is the reason why. Okay, they're unable to institutionalize like mechanisms to ensure that these things happen. And so female scholars continue to be a minority in the organization, even to this day, while feminist scholarship is largely limited to a gender series, book series. And against this backdrop, the ghettoization of feminist scholarship and the hollowing out of discourses on gender remains a constant threat. So from an institutional perspective, I think feminist scholars in CODESRIA have had very kind of incomplete results and very tenuous results. But from an intellectual perspective, I think their work has been stunning. And I wish I could get into it like in great detail here, but I can't because I'm probably running out of time, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to make 2 points. It's 2 slides, that's it. So there are many different intellectual strands that they're dealing with, right, during this time around the gender workshop and the work that they produce out of it. And as a collective, it must be about 50 different individuals, women and men, some men who are explicitly self-identify as feminists, grapple with 2 very important strands. The first is northern feminism, right? So it's a kind of white Western feminism, which is a false universalism, okay? And they argue that this false universalism restricts the ways in which African social researchers are able to think and theorize. We are forced to take on board these norms and waste time tilting at windmills to find out why we deviate from these patterns instead of finding out what our own patterns and realities are. So it's like just a waste of time. But they also think about Africanist historiography, right? That kind of classical matriarchy thesis, the idea that like a return to like kind of pre-colonial civilizations and an attempt to kind of counteract like racist colonial myths about Africans having no history, right? And they say, look, this is also a false particularism, because in revolting against Western ethnocentric false universalizations, we should be careful not to enshrine in their place equally false essentializations of Africanity, which disenfranchise us from examining certain aspects of oppressive relations. So you've got, between the 2 strands, universalism and particularism, they reject both. And what they do, I think, is they suggest a third way, which is a kind of a holistic understanding, which is to work towards the universal, not to assume, but to work towards it, from careful and deep engagement with multiple particular perspectives. This means understanding is a collective enterprise and should be judged by how well an intellectual community makes sense of and travels their social world. Understanding doesn't belong to any one of us individually. Understanding is for us together as a community. I love this quote. This is Ayesha Imam. This is not to say all points of our approach are uniquely peculiar to African scholars, but it is we, with whom I am concerned here. Okay. So it's a sense that we must address each other as a community. Okay, so I think this has some really interesting implications for what it means to do African intellectual work. The question of what counts as African intellectual work is often characterized by the conviction that the origin of ideas matters a great deal to whether intellectual work counts as African. But this narrative suggests that ideas are like water, right? They do not obey the political or cultural bounds we construct. The river of ideas has multiple sources, and many different kinds of thinkers come to drink from its waters, and thereby enrich the common pool of knowledge. So they're drawing from multiple strands: northern feminism, Africanist historiography, Maoist epistemology, all sorts of different kinds of intellectual strands, right? But for them, what seems to matter more is not so much the origin of ideas, but the structure of their intellectual community. Okay, and I think there are 3 characteristics here. The first is that African feminist scholars are deeply embedded in and responsive to their contexts, and as such actively attempt to cultivate a historical imagination. The second is that African feminist scholars are not isolated from each other, but instead located within an institutional framework that enables them to act as a pan-African intellectual community. And the third is that they address their work to African scholars rather than the spectre of the West. They don't waste their time tilting at windmills. How much time do I have on the side?
We have 1 more minute.
Okay, so what does this mean? I think this actually is a new standard of excellence. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about standards of excellence within our universities and how they've been shaped by colonial rule, right? Lewis Gordon talks about a geography of reason, right? The idea that scholarship from the north is excellent in virtue of its intellectual and geographic location. And Ontology, who is a wonderful, wonderful philosopher, has spoken extensively about epistemic dependence. The idea that the attainment of scholarly excellence in the African Academy involves the attainment of the proper understanding that African scholarship is fundamentally derivative of and dependent on Northern scholarship. That is what you learn when you go to university, right? But they have something different. They think the question of geography is irrelevant to considerations of scholastic excellence, whether African or otherwise. Excellence is the function of a community rather than the attribute of a place. And I think these standards promote greater collaboration among African scholars, right? Because they're saying, how are we as a community working together? And thereby foster a more cohesive, cumulative, and autonomous knowledge system. Last time. Okay, so they're introducing new standards of excellence, and I think this is deep institutional work. Deep institutional work. What does that mean for how we understand knowledge systems today? I think it means that contestations over inequality within the commons can be a source of intellectual and organizational renewal when marginalized members are able to organize successfully to compel dominant members to recognize the reasonableness of their concerns. Their collective action can lead to new institutions that depart in meaningful ways from skewed colonial institutions. Okay, and this means that the collective agency of marginalized individuals is central to the flourishing of knowledge commons. So when we look at our universities, right, the people who are most responsible for how well our universities do are not the people with the power. They are the people without the power. And their collective action is what will create a kind of dynamism. It's not just, say, female scholars, black female scholars within our universities. It's workers. It's people who don't have access to these so-called public institutions. It's the most disenfranchised. They are the ones who are responsible for the long-term flourishing of our public institutions. Okay, I think that's it.
Thought-provoking set of papers. Can I get an indication of comments, questions, responses? Okay. Ranka?
I didn't understand. How is CODESRIA funded?
Pardon?
I saw your table of public and
Yeah.
private and all that. How are they funded? CODESRIA? What? They're expanding, they're doing this, they're doing that. How? Economically.
Do you want me to answer or should we take that? Okay, so they first started off by being self-funded through membership fees, and then structural adjustment hit, and universities no longer had any more money, and the currency devaluation meant that it was like almost impossible to exchange currencies, and so they became donor dependent.
So membership fees means university as well members?
Well, the representatives of institutions. So, for example, like you'd have like my institution, the Institution for Social and Economic Research, or the Faculty of Humanities, or so it wasn't usually like an entire university, but institutions within the university. So then the representative of that institution would pay membership fees, and that was what enabled them to kind of get going. But like I said, structural adjustment happens and all of that kind of collapses and they become very much donor dependent.
Okay.
You ready?
Well, I'm going to start backwards simply because it's the paper I remember easiest. It's an extraordinarily broad paper and I think at some point you're going to have to pick an angle and narrow it down a little bit. That's why in a sense it's difficult to comment because you don't know where to start. But some minor details, I do think you need to, and in a broader sense I suppose that's what this conference is about. I mean, what is African feminism exactly?
Yeah.
I do think you need to situate yourself as a white scholar studying this. And judging by your accent, not an African, but that could be a superficial judgment. But yeah, situate yourself in relationship to your material. And then my question would be, well, I'm slightly suspicious of these men who call themselves feminists. I just don't think Paul Zeleza, Paul is an excellent historian. He's not, to me, he's not feminist. And nowhere more so in his reluctance to deal with Sheikh Anta Diop's theories on African matriarchy, which he has, I think, in common with most African male historians. They're not ready to deal. And so it's left to people like Amadi Yuma and myself, for instance, to carry that forward. But here is simply just being unjust. I mean, Diop specifically set out to create a broad theory of African history. He was not interested in particularities, except as he drew on his own Senegalese experience of matriarchy, which nowadays we wouldn't even call matriarchy, we'd call it transitional phase. But obviously it's then left to Amadi Yume for the Igbo, myself for the Khoisan, and I can only conclude that it says a lot about the conservativeness of history as a discipline, that so few African feminists are able to do this work elsewhere in Africa. I mean, history is really, but so in a lot of ways it's work that remains to be done. But anyway, that's just off my personal deep end, yes. But is everybody an African feminist who calls themselves an African feminist? And is it okay for people just to say, well, I'm a feminist, so you know, you get to quote me in your feminist, I don't know. But for me, those are kind of issues that I think you need to come up with some sort of position on. Yeah, the other two papers, I think land is an issue that you both address, you in your pictures and you in your facts. But when you have a patriarchal system that only allows males to own land, then you're setting up for structural inequalities. And when you're talking about institutional change that is going to, I mean, why are women in the labor market in the first place? Because they're escaping a system that rests on their free labor and their inability to have title to land. And post-94 has been the story of them running away from that system, and in a lot of ways completely undermining that system, because when you take away the free labor on which that system depends, you pretty much leave the traditional leaders dependent on government subsidies. So to the extent that women are able to escape, they are escaping. And that creates a certain urban labor market. So maybe you need to think about that, how systems structure institutions. If you, and I think nowhere more, so clearly in some way you are because of your background, but you're not, and possibly the reason why you're not is because there's not really much work done around it. So good luck.
Sorry.
But the custom of Uksori locality and marrying of widows to their husbands' brothers, I think is particularly topical in this age of AIDS. I mean, you take a province like KZN, where what 1/3 of the population is seropositive, and you see a widow problem emerging on the horizon. So I'm kind of torn. You know, is it African feminist to judge a community in crisis that is reaching for maybe not so traditional or customary, I mean, to be quite post-British colonialism tradition of taking care of widows on the one hand, but on the other hand, A is responsible for further spread of AIDS, and B really condemns these women to a life of neo-slavery. And so yeah, these are difficult questions, and I'm not surprised you reach for the Bible, but I'm not sure that the biblical myth is the way to approach it. But there is a huge widow movement that I'd be happy to connect you to, that really raised my consciousness around this issue and the kind of problems they explore and the way they use collective action to if not, at least to tell this, at least to express themselves, at least to say, we're here, and this is an aspect of the HIV/AIDS crisis that doesn't get paid attention to. I'm pleased to say that the Commission for Gender Equality before my tenure did a report, but that's actually been the last report on it, which was now over 12 years ago. So I'm pleased you're paying it attention, and I'll be happy to hook you up. I do think Ruth is a bit of a distraction, but I understand why you go that route. It's difficult territory.
Do you want to respond?
Okay, so I will respond on your suggestion around the land issue, and especially, like you pointed out, as someone who comes from the north, where agriculture and land are such big things in terms of how it underlies the way people survive and how people earn a living. And I also just want to comment in the context of conversations that I've had with some colleagues in the Ecos department who are institutional economists around issues of land, especially also in the context of this idea of a radical economic transformation. And it was just, again, just highlighting the importance of land and just pointing out that, you know, the place to begin actually in terms of this radical economic transformation is around land, as in a place like Limpopo, for example. We were talking about how Limpopo produces a lot of the fruits and vegetables in the country, but also tomatoes. Apparently, Limpopo is one of the biggest producers in the country, in the world. So I think, you know, case studies like that just point to where actually we can begin to think about radical economic transformation that is radical in the sense that it is inclusive, and it's radical in the sense that it also includes women. So not yet an expert on that, and as you're pointing out, not much work has actually been done in that area specifically. So a lot of work that I need to do, and stuff that I actually do need to think about. So thank you for your comment.
Well, just if I can respond, like you know, what it highlights is the royal stuff-up of post-1994. I mean, if you want to talk about the major weakness in ANC economic policy, it's that their policy, or rather their lack of action in relation to land, is concocted by a bunch of urbanized people who've never farmed and think that food is something you buy at Woolworths. So I understand, you know, the reluctance of the academic community to deal with it. So it's deep waters you'd get yourself into, but I think it, like I said, it would shed light on how structures mold institutions. I think if you start at the labor market without looking at land, then you lack an explanatory heaviness that you will get with, because we could get into it.
Yes, and we do need to give more responses. No, go ahead.
And I just wanted to speak to exactly her point where she's saying where I situated myself in the labor market was not very structural, because I situated myself from a lived experience of a woman who started her labor market experience in corporate SA. Yeah. So that exactly, it's so clear that I started there, but again, I started there and I worked back to address my lived experience as a black rural woman from Limpopo, and that's where the land issues are. So I suppose it's marrying those two things, and actually ideally not in one paper, because those two things are kind of different. The situations are different, so different papers to address those two things, but the other issue, which is a structural issue, land issue, is also important.
Yes, but I mean, I think also that we hear so much about, I think Yvette is right, but I think that what you're focusing on is really much needed. I mean, it seems as though we're always talking about kind of structural transformation in the workplace, and kind of take certain assumptions around what the workplace is, what corporate South Africa is, that I think, you know, you kind of started to kind of pick at quite importantly. And so I mean, I think, you know, so don't abandon this project either. I mean, I think that an African feminist, I think we have a lot of women talking about it, but certainly not people who are asking the ideological, but also the structural questions that you're asking, that I think, you know, are very clearly sorely missed from the kind of current debate that seems like it's kind of moving, but actually is very often kind of circulating the same kinds of ideas. So thank you very much. Other questions?
Oh, I have question. I have some, but I'll wait as chair. More questions, comments?
I just, oh, sorry.
Thanks. So, I have two, sort of a comment and then a suggestion. For Jamela, I actually love the idea of, well, you said there were two different case studies. So the one is the kind of broad South African women's labour market with all the economic statistics, I suppose one could, and policies. But then you contrast that with your personal lived experience in investment banking, of all things, you know. And I actually wondered whether they were really two different case studies, or whether the one is like the bigger context for the other one. So it's like a macro and a micro, so that some of the things that are affecting the whole labour market would also be impacting even in the investment banking boardroom. So it was just maybe a little different way of looking at it to think about. And then for Thembinkosi, I was also thinking land and property rights, because you started off by saying Ruth was land rich, I think, resource rich but cash poor. And so then one of the ways that economists would think about it is to say, well, if you could allocate some kind of property right, not necessarily private property, so I'm thinking of Nimi's, commons, right? But some way of, then you can use your resources to leverage the cash side, which enables development. So that might be a way to go. But then as your presentation went on, I thought actually maybe what you need here is Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, because that kind of acknowledges the resources that people have when they make certain kinds of decisions. So rather than judging a decision out of context as good or as bad, you say, well, what did this person have? Their personal resources, their economic resources, all the other things that they have, networks, family, all of those things that resulted in this kind of a decision. So that might be also a rich theoretical area to explore. Thank you.
Sorry, Thembinkosi, I didn't let you respond to the previous thing. Do you want to respond to different things that have been?
Yeah. No. Thanks, colleagues. I think the key thing. Thanks for the suggestion as well with regard to capability approach, because the way I see this, like I indicated, it's complex. So a multi-pronged approach would be appropriate, because some of these things are structural, systemic, and human as well. Dealing with just one aspect of it is not doing justice to it. So and coming to the issue of land, if we look at the service delivery philosophy, for instance, in South Africa, is that of give and take, recipients and someone delivering the resources. And economists would do cost-benefit analysis, for instance, to look at the expenditure, government's expenditure, and you look at, if you look at the gains, because the person has not been dealt with or addressed issues around attitudes, thinking, because if we talk of houses, for instance, having houses built for people has many issues, because issues of identity, for instance, many people who are recipients of those services and houses do not identify themselves with those houses. It's something that was done for them. Hence, if for me the philosophy was that we would capacitate people and create conducive environment for them to develop themselves, then in that way I could build my own matchbox house, and I would be so proud of it, more than the mansion that the government would build for me that I cannot even identify with. So those are some of the issues that I think we need to address, because many of government programs, for instance, if you look at agriculture, they would have different packages that would give people seeds, would give people tractors, would give them farms and so on. And if the person, the attitude and the thinking of the people has not been enabled to identify with all those things, and they are not part of these things, hence a core production of knowledge, of solutions, of approaches to the challenges that we have, could be one way of addressing some of these things in a more sustainable way, in a more meaningful way that would ensure impact in society. So yes, thanks colleagues for your suggestions.
I'm still like kind of conceptualizing my question, but you spoke about the blesser and sex work kind of dynamic in the country, and you spoke about it from a very kind of exploitative perspective of like women being oppressed and therefore having to be desperate and do sex work. But now there's this debate in this country about legalizing sex work, and it's mainly premised on agency of women. Like women can do sex work if they want to, it's their bodies. I just wanted to know your personal view on that, because I also kind of struggle. I struggle because I'm kind of in the middle of two worlds, where I come from the township and I can see the desperation, and I can't be in a position to judge someone who doesn't have food at home and needs the money. But at the same time, I come from like an academic perspective where I'm like, men are using this to kind of oppress women. So what's your take?
Before you answer that, maybe I can take advantage of my position as chair and pose a few questions and suggestions to especially Thembinkosi and Nimi. And then perhaps we can have your closing comments from all the panelists. So, Thembinkosi. Sorry. Oh, you were just coughing. I thought you were. I thought it was like. I heard an inflection. No. That wasn't there.
He wasn't cough.
I don't want to lose that last question around how to think about, how to think about power in kind of in transactional in relationships that we decide are transactional with so I just want to piggyback on it. So Thembinkosi, it seems to me that you're doing various things in this. Certain things that you're doing explicitly, and then there's certain things that you seem to suggest at the beginning, but then I'm not quite sure what happens to them as you proceed. You clearly make very deliberate choices about anchoring your discussion, your exploration around Ruth, right? So you choose a specific biblical narrative, right? And yet there's a sense in which some of the stuff that you're doing in the paper doesn't need Ruth and doesn't need the Bible. And so my question to you is around not abandoning Ruth and the Bible, but what is that beyond the metaphor and beyond kind of recognizing some things that are familiar across different patriarchal practices of exchange and marriage and property and so on. What is the attachment? What is this anchoring through Ruth or through this kind of biblical narrative? What else does it allow you to do? Because it seems to me that there is something useful that kind of biblical narrative or that biblical linkage allows you to do in making sense of what you're calling what did you say? You said something about not losing the place of the person, right? And it seems to me that what I'm missing from the paper, from the presentation, is a sense of what kind of resource this world, that this biblical narrative that Ruth specifically brings to how these decisions and how these kind of power contexts and negotiations are made sense of, right? So basically what I'm asking, crudely, is, okay, so you say, well, there's something, obviously they're different contexts, but there's something similar here, and there's something, and this world of Ruth is both very removed and not very removed. It's part of how people, it's part of the collective mental landscape of the now as well, right? So it has, it's so you're saying something, it seems to me you're saying something about how people negotiate and make sense of decisions they have to make now, and one of the ways in which they do that is through accessing a range of ideological and conceptual and cultural and religious kind of sites of meaning, right? So they're thinking about public economic debates in the country. They're thinking about relationships to government, but they're also thinking about what makes sense in terms of what is natural or logical or, I don't know, ordained in terms of kind of relationships of kind of gender power. But it seems to me that you, having brought it in, having started with it, it then scares you somewhat, and so you just kind of push it to the side. So I suppose my question is around what would happen. What happens if you retain that engagement? I mean, there's a reason you start with it. There's a reason it's in this paper. There's a way in which you can do this paper without Ruth, right? But there's a reason you bring that biblical narrative, and I do think it has very specific uses, but I'm not sure about the ambivalence with which you treat it in this paper, and that may just be a function of trying to do many things and the limitations of time. But I'd like to push you to kind of speak to that more directly. And then Mimi, I mean, I think it's a fascinating study of CODESRIA. I have a few concerns though. The first concern is that I'm not convinced that the only way, I mean, I think it's an important study of CODESRIA and relationships to African feminism, but to the extent that there are several other Pan-African conversations on African feminism that are existing outside CODESRIA prior to this moment, I'm a little uneasy around two things. I'm uneasy around kind of the framing of kind of Pan-Africanist, even Pan-African feminist, but also even Pan-African feminist academic conversation as kind of starting in CODESRIA. I mean, many of these people who enter CODESRIA and are able to organize within CODESRIA belong to other Pan-Africanist formations. But also, of course, the bulk of African feminist conversation happens outside of CODESRIA, always has, always will. Secondly, I mean, I think that CODESRIA is important, but CODESRIA is a social science specific, right? And so in many ways does not, I mean, the African feminist conversations, Pan-Africanist organizing and publication, much more significant happening outside CODESRIA, outside of the social sciences, pre this moment where there's that big push and intervention in CODESRIA. So I suppose so, and I don't know to what extent we can talk about what happened, the successes of the interventions into CODESRIA without also talking about the larger context of African feminist scholarship, African feminist intellectual production outside of CODESRIA. That I mean, people like Imam and Mama and Lewis and all those people who now who are part of that also belong for a much longer time to discussions outside of that, right? And academic discussions specifically as well. So not just African, not just movements, but I mean kind of conversations and academic production that exists across the continent in different kind of transnational formations prior to this moment. And so it seems to me that part of even just engaging with CODESRIA and how this disruption happens in CODESRIA also has to think about what enables it, and CODESRIA is not what enables it. And yeah, so that's my I think that's the main thing. Yeah, and also just to think of, you know, just to remember that it may be a commons, but it's a social science commons, right? It's not where African feminism in the academy happens. It's a very specific publication platform. It's a very specific ideologically as well, not just in terms of kind of it's not the center of the of the Pan-African academy and organizing pathways, that it is one avenue that people choose or stay away from for very, very specific reasons, even as they engage in other kind of Pan-African linkages that predate it, that exist alongside it, and that you know, and also of course that there's a very deliberate choice by many African feminist academics not to be in CODESRIA. Not just because it's hostile, because everything is masculine. Many places are masculinist, but the other. But there's an entire kind of range of kind of research. So it doesn't. I don't know that we can. I mean, I think it's interesting as a case study, but I think that if we're going to talk about kind of African feminisms and kind of the Pan-African knowledge enterprise, we have to temper the claims we can make about African feminism when we're only talking about African feminism in CODESRIA. Okay, I'm going to stop and then let each of the panelists have the final say.
Should I begin?
Okay.
Or do you want to start, Mimi, seeing as maybe how comments are still fresh?
African feminisms, there are many. It was about a particular emergence within CODESRIA. So it's actually a study of CODESRIA rather than a study of African feminism.
I know, but you're talking about how I'm saying, but even that can't be studied as though it's a thing that happens in CODESRIA. It doesn't just happen in CODESRIA. Part of what allows it to happen, and all of these people, even the few out of that later stage that you name, come from other things.
And so there's like many different strands, and one of those strands that I try to look at was AWOD, right? I mean, I think like Yvette was right that there's a lot going on in this paper, and it's not actually a paper, really. It isn't. It's too much into one piece. But so there are many different strands, and one of the strands that I tried to look at was AWOD. But like you said, it goes back a really long time, way before CODESRIA was even started. There have been different kinds of African feminist intellectual conversations across the continent. And so perhaps one of the limitations of this is that I've just tried to put too much into one presentation, so I'm not actually able to deal carefully enough with each element. And I just very briefly wanted to respond to the question of positionality. So I guess I sound foreign, right? Because my mother was German and my father is Moroccan, and I grew up in Yeovil, which is a Pan-African community, really. So I went to school with people who spoke Yoruba and Arabic and French and Kiswahili, and I did not speak South African languages at home. And as a consequence, I mean, increasingly so, when I increasingly seeing how people that I grew up with and loved have been treated by this country, I have increasingly felt like I do not belong here. And consequently, I've increasingly felt drawn to kind of a bigger Pan-African identity. So I have this kind of like weird insider-outsider kind of liminal status when I'm thinking about CODESRIA, because I don't fully belong to any kind of Pan-African identity. You wouldn't see me as African. Most people.
How would you
not.
self-identify?
Oh. I don't think we have choices. I used to think we had choices, and I think that increasingly you don't actually have a choice as to how you have less of a choice as to how you self-identify. But definitely not as a nationalist. I wouldn't identify as South African. And I would identify as African, but then that makes some people really unhappy. And I'm sensitive to that. And I'm sensitive to the history of that. So I'm left in this space of, well, I'm trying to make the best that I can. But I think that Pan-Africanism has a kind of a beauty to it, and a kind of an expansive imagination, and a complexity. And I didn't really quite get into it. I couldn't do it justice in the presentation, but I wanted to say that it creates new things. It creates new ways of seeing. Yeah.
All right. With respect to the question about sex work and people's personal circumstances, my view is that I have no say in what you do or whoever does in what people do with their bodies. Is their bodies. However, for me, I would appreciate a situation where such decisions about what you do about your body are not as a result of being forced by economic circumstances. Hence, I'm advocating for making change within one sphere of influence. We will not change the world, but we can contribute in the areas wherein we have, wherein we operate. So, if I can contribute towards ensuring that my female neighbor does not resort to having to engage in sex work because of poverty, that I should definitely do. And related to this is the issue of the porn industry, and like I indicated, the complexity of these issues, systemic, structural, and human as well, that the industry is booming for several reasons. One of those being that there's a demand for the product. And for me, one of the things I could do to contribute in addressing this is trying to conscientize the consumer of the material about how this is driving this multi-billion industry, to bring it at a personal level, because there are so many implications to it, consequences of all these people being abducted, children, and all of that. So if one can appeal to the conscience of the consumer, then I would feel that I would have contributed in making some change. The use of Ruth I think you correctly pointed out that in trying to do many things, sometimes you can end up being ineffective in all of them. But no,
ineffective at all.
Okay. One part of one factor that contributed to this is the current situation in South Africa. We know about what's happening in churches, the uncritical use of scripture, and part of this was trying to encourage critical reading of scripture, whether it's Christian or any other religious material that we consume, that it would be helpful to engage such in a more critical fashion, so that we don't get naively into all these spaces. But then the other advantage was that I could use the same material to mirror the South African situation and sort of draw lessons from that with regard to personal circumstances and how we need to exercise agency, because these challenges will be with us for a long while, I think. But people need to do something about their personal circumstances to try and transcend your personal circumstances, because we will not be changing all the people's ideologies, thinking about women in order for change to happen, but within our little areas within which we can influence or make change. That I think we should do. Thank you.
Jamela, do you have a final word?
Yes, final words. But I'll try to just be brief. And I just like that I get to comment after everybody else, because I think my comment sort of kind of links in with all their comments. And I wanted to start with is it Mimi or Nimi?
Mimi.
Oh, is it Nimi?
Nimi.
N-I-M-I.
Nimi.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
So Nimi's comment, the final comment you made about different ways of knowing, I think that's also important in the context of what I'm going to say. And Thembinkosi, you were talking about being critical, and I wanted to speak about that in the context of the land debate. And I suppose land is such a big it's a big thorny issue in South Africa, and I see part of the problem with addressing land being the problem that it reflects different forms of oppression, which are sometimes material oppressions, but they're also ideological oppressions. And I suppose dealing with land and the solution to land and how institutions and economies need to change to achieve some form of justice in terms of land requires knowing differently. It requires more than an economic solution. It requires epistemic shifts in terms of knowing what the problem is, how the problem presents itself, but also a different form of oppression, which is also epistemic. Because when you talk about land, there seems to be a problem in terms of just communicating the issue of justice. And there are lots of philosophical debates about, who owned the land in the first place? Why is land such an issue? And all these things, I see they're such a problem, and they block the solution, because there are so many complicated debates that are happening around land. So I'll just stop there and just say, these things are complicated, and beyond just grappling with material oppression, it's also about, different forms of oppressions that we need to grapple with in order to solve all these problems and change the world, as Thembinkosi was suggesting.
Thank you very much, Nimi, Thembinkosi, Jamela. I know we ran over a little bit, but that's because I made us start late, so I didn't want you to be penalized for my tardiness. So we've used up the allocated 2 hours. It does mean we probably have to walk a little faster to the other session, but it's still tea. Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions and your comments. Thank you for 3 really rich and thought-provoking papers. Fabulous.